Hi guys! Welcome to week 4, and today we're going to be reading The Forbidden Library by Dango Wexler. So I'm going to read the blurb for you. Alice always thought fairy tales had happy endings. That, along with everything else, changed after she met her first fairy hovering in the kitchen, threatening her father. The next day, her father left, never to return. Poor Alice dutifully goes off to live with an uncle she's never heard of, a mysterious old man with an impossibly massive library full of books she's forbidden to read. But when she runs into a talking cat who sneaks her inside and an arrogant boy who dares her to open a book, it's hard to resist. The moment she reads the first line, Alice finds herself inside the book, with only one way out. It seems Uncle Geryon is much more than he claimed to be. Good thing Alice is too, because she'll need her courage and wits to face the challenges to come. Okay, so I'm going to read the first chapter. Chapter 1. The Fairy. Much later, Alice would wonder what might have happened if she had gone to bed when she was supposed to. It was a fluke, really, because she was the sort of girl who almost followed the rules. But she'd been doing schoolwork, and she'd lost track of time. It was a Saturday night, and her tutor, Miss Juniper, had assigned her another chunk of algebra for Monday morning. Alice excelled in all her subjects. She never would have allowed it to be otherwise, but in algebra her excellence was born of hard work and long hours rather than natural talent, so she'd be determined to make an early start. She wouldn't be bothering anyone either. Her room had its own little writing desk, and even its own electric lamp, which her father had installed 3 years before with the boast of no daughter of his was going to ruin her eyes scribbling by gaslight. Her father had been working late again. When Alice heard the telltale creak of the front door, she weighed the odds and decided he'd probably be happier to see her than angry that she was still up. She shrugged into her robe and padded into the hall and down the stairs. The late-night silence was a little unnerving. Alice had grown up in a house that had practically bustled with servants and guests, even in the middle of the night, and she was used to seeing strangers about. But the servants had departed one by one as times had grown mean, until only cook, Miss Juniper, and her father's man were left, and the visitors were less common than they used to be. The guest rooms that lined the hallway were all shut up now, with the sheets draped over the furniture. She passed the doors quickly, tugging her robe a little tighter, and ducked into the servants' stairs that led her to the kitchen. Her father would probably be there, fixing himself something hot to drink. Soon enough, the swinging door at the bottom of the steps was outlined in yellow light. Alice put her hand out to push it open, but as her fingers brushed the wood, she heard the voices and realized her father wasn't alone. "You have to know what we can do for you, Mr. Creighton," she said someone who wasn't her father. "Someone is going to take advantage of it sooner or later." Alice turned away at once. Being up late was one thing, but eavesdropping on her father's business conversations was quite another. She put her foot up on the first step when the sound of her father's voice brought her up short. "Don't you dare!" he shouted. "Don't you dare threaten my family!" The words hung in the air for long seconds, like a fading firework. Her father never shouted, at least not in her hearing. He was a quiet, honest man who dealt fairly with everyone, put flowers on her mother's grave once a month, and went to church every Sunday. Hearing him talk like that was like watching a teddy bear yawn and reveal a mouth full of fangs. Alice stood perfectly still, not daring even to move her eyes. She wanted to run, though she knew she ought to, but whatever was being said was obviously not for her ears, but her feet felt like lead weights. "Mr. Creighton," said the other man, "nobody's threatening. I'm just stating a fact. Nothing wrong with stating a fact, is there? No law against it." His voice was odd, high, and nasal. Alice could hear the strange sound as well, kind of an urgent thrum, thrum, thrum. "Don't mess me around," her father said, not shouting now, but still angrier than she'd ever heard him. "We both know what you're here to say, and I'm sure you know what my answer is going to be." "I strongly recommend you reconsider your position, Mr. Creighton." The thrumming grew louder. "For the sake of everyone involved." "By God!" Alice's father said. "So help me, I ought to break your ugly head against the wall." "You could do that," the other man said. "You could do that, Mr. Creighton, but you won't. For you know it must be unwise." His voice dropped a fraction, for the girl most of all. Slowly, ever so slowly, Alice turned around. Her heart was still beating so hard, it seemed a wonder that her father couldn't hear it. She stepped back down to the door, carefully avoiding the creaky step, and pressed her fingers into the crack of light. It was wrong, possibly the most wrong thing she had ever done in her entire life, but she had to see. She gave the swinging door the lightest touch, and the crack widened into a gap big enough for a garter snake, to which she applied her eye. The light made her squint. On one side of the room was her father, still in his suit, looking rumpled. His hair was damp with sweat. One of his hands was curled around the handle of a cast-iron frying pan sitting on the range, as though he meant to swing it and make good on his threat. Across from him, hanging in the air, was a fairy. When Alice had been a little girl, her father had given her a book called The Enchanted Forest. It was a big book, made with thick paper, and had large type with pen and ink illustrations on each facing page. She'd probably been a bit too old for it, truth behold, but she'd read it anyway, and as she read every piece of printed material that fell within her reach. It was the story of a rather stupid little girl who wandered into an enchanted forest and caused a good deal of havoc among the creatures who lived there. One of those creatures had been a fairy. It was a slim, childlike figure, with wide eyes and a button nose, wearing flowing robes, held aloft by gauzy insect wings. Alice had always imagined the wings in translucent greens and blues, like a butterfly's, and it had looked down at the little girl with an air of amused benevolence, while it stood daintily in her raised palm. At that age, Alice had grasped the idea that some things in the book were real, others were not. Questioning her father had revealed that there were such things as lions, tigers, and elephants. He had promised a visit to the zoo, which had yet to happen, while trolls, centaurs, and dragons were the figments of writers' overactive imaginations. Alice remembered feeling vaguely annoyed at the author of The Enchanted Forest, who had clearly intended to deceive little girls possessing less penetrating intellects than her own. There was, her father had told her, no such thing as fairies, either. The thing hovering in the air in Alice's kitchen was similar enough to the picture in the book to be instantly recognizable, but he was larger for one thing. The creature in the book had been insectile, 6 inches high at most, while this creature was a good 2 feet from head to heel. His wings were enormous, considerably bigger than his slender body, and beat the air so fast that they were a blur, like a hummingbird's. They were colored, not in greens and blues, but yellow and black, which put Alice in mind of something nasty and poisonous. The fairy's skin was off-white and gnarled, with warty growths sprouting clusters of thick black hair. His scalp was bare and bald as an egg, gleaming wetly in the electric light. He had no nose at all, and his eyes were wide, but black from edge to edge. When he spoke, she could see a mouthful of needle-like teeth and a long red tongue like a snake's. Alice closed her eyes. This, she thought, is ridiculous. There are no such thing as fairies. She gave herself a pinch on the arm, which hurt, and slowly counted to 10. When I open my eyes, she thought, he will be gone. I really wish you'd at least hear my offer, said the nasal voice. Alice opened her eyes. The fairy was still there. He had hovered closer to her father, his wings thruming, one tiny finger wagging in under her nose. I will not, Alice's father said. I will not entertain any sort of offer. Go back and tell your master that, and tell him if he troubles me again, I'll... The fairy waited, lip curled in a cocky grin that showed his teeth. You'll what, Mr. Creighton? Get out, he shouted. Get out of my house! There was a long moment of silence. The fairy hovered impudently, as if to demonstrate that he didn't have to go, just because her father had said so. Then, with an affected sigh, he spun into the air and zipped out into the open doorway on the other side of the room. Alice heard one of the front windows rattle open. Her father sagged like a heavy weight had been fastened around his shoulders. He let go of the frying pan and leaned on the range for support. Alice wanted to run to him, but she didn't dare. Whatever she had just seen, and she was still not certain what she had just seen, it was something she had not been supposed to witness. Alice's father took a long, slow breath, closed his eyes, and blew out slowly, tickling the edges of his mustache. Then his eyes snapped open, full of panic. Alice, he said under his breath. Oh, God! All of a sudden he was running, struggling to get his feet under him. caromingly off the kitchen doorway and out toward the main stairs. Alice was caught for a moment in stunned surprise, then started running herself, back up the servants' stairs, heedless of the creaking. He had made it to her door only a few seconds before she had arrived. Finding the door slightly open, he flung it ajar and stared wide-eyed into the empty room. His expression, bathed in the glow of her electric desk lamp, was the most terrifying thing Alice had ever seen. She hurried to his side and grabbed his arm. "Father, is something wrong? You—" He gestured weakly at her empty room, then down at her. "I thought I was studying," Alice said, "and I got up for a moment. I'm sorry if I startled you." All at once his fierceness melted, and he wrapped his arms around her in a hug so tight he lifted her off the ground. "Alice," he said, his scratchy cheek pressed against her forehead. "Alice." "I'm here, Father." She squirmed until she worked her own arms free, then put them around him as far as they would go. "It'll be all right," he said. She wasn't sure if he was talking to himself or not. "Everything is going to be all right." "Of course it is," she said. When he let go, there was something new in his face, a wild determination so far out of the ordinary that made Alice feel scared and proud of him, both at once. He set her down gently and put his hands on her shoulders and looked her in the eye. "I love you. You know that, don't you?" Alice felt herself blushing. "Of course." His eyes were already miles away. He patted her shoulder absently and then hurried down toward his study. Alice looked after him, wondering about the decision she'd seen in his eyes. Then, because she was a girl who followed the rules, she went back into her room and went to bed. Okay, guys, that's going to be it for this week. I hope you enjoyed, and this time I'm actually going to return the books as I finish them. So this should be in the library fairly soon. And luckily for you, your library is not forbidden. So if you would like to read this book or any other fantasy fiction book that might interest you, then I would greatly suggest that you go try to check this out in the library in the coming days. So yes, thank you and goodbye.